Let's chat about the age-old question, zoom lens versus a prime lens. Of course, nobody can answer that for you. It's very individual for every photographer, and in my experience, it's very particular to the situation, what I want to photograph. That's why I have both. So yes, of course, if you can afford to have both, just have both. Easy answer. Now you don't have to decide, right? But you still have to decide which one to take with you. Unless you just take both, and you're carrying around a bunch of stuff. You might not even use the one. It's still a hard decision. But if you're looking to invest in a lens and you're gonna make a decision, a prime lens versus zoom lens, how do you make that decision? Well, I'm just gonna share some of my thoughts and experiences with it. Maybe it'll give you something to think about that you didn't before. But in the end, my best suggestion for you is to test it out yourself if you can. Either find a friend that has the lens you're interested in using, or try and rent some and try both that you're thinking about doing and see what's a better fit. You kind of can't go wrong. You're gonna make the best use out of whatever it is you end up getting. But of course you don't wanna make that wrong decision and regret it and then wish you had bought the other thing, which I know can happen. I've done it in the past myself. So let's start with the prime lens. When I first got into wildlife photography, to me, this style of lens was the holy grail of wildlife photography, the big, fast prime lens. My first big, fast prime lens was a Nikon 500mm f4, and now I have Nikon's 400mm 2.8. So yeah, I lusted after this thing so bad, a big prime, not specifically this one. This didn't exist when I first started. And I thought that was gonna make everything better. And it did, it certainly did. When I got that big prime lens, my photography certainly jumped up a level, but it didn't solve everything for me. So what were some of the advantages and why did I want this? Well, I'm not gonna lie, in the beginning, and there's still a part of it now that kind of connects to this, it just looks cool having a big prime lens, right? It just feels pretty badass. You have this big giant lens on there, it's attention getting, people might look at you, you know, it's like, yeah, like I've made it, right? That's like one of the things that happens with these big prime lenses. It really is not that big a deal in regards to that. Once you have it for a while, it's just like, that's just whatever, you know? That's like a silly reason to buy one. But it was part of it, especially in the beginning. When I didn't have one, every person, every photographer I saw that had one, I was just like, ooh, like, you know, and just assuming they were the best photographer ever because of that lens they were shooting. And I certainly know, and I'm sure you know, deep down, that's not the reality of it, right? The lens and the camera gear does not make the photographer. We all know that. But that was a part of it. So what was the other part of it? I just wanted a low light lens, right? And that look, that big prime look, that super blurred out of focus background and just clean bokeh, right? Just obliterated background, just smooth, buttery bokeh. That's what I wanted. And this is the only way to get it, right? No, it's certainly not. Does this make it easier? Yes, it does, right? So to me, the biggest advantages of a big fast prime, and now, especially with modern mirrorless, especially on Nikon's line, the smaller, lighter weight primes, which are great, but the biggest advantage of them is speed. That's kind of it, right? Speed of focus. They're just a little bit snappier at grabbing focus and sticking with it. And in the mirrorless stuff, from at least my experience with Nikon, it's stickier with the eye tracking and that sort of thing. It just works amazingly. So it's fast. The other advantage of these big fast prime lens is a fast aperture. So a low aperture number, which means it lets more light in, which is why we have this giant piece of glass on the front. And so that allows me to shoot in lower light conditions and keep my ISO down and or keep my shutter speed higher. So there is flat out an advantage there. Is it enough to justify the cost of these? Well, that's really up to you, right? Everybody has a different budget. Those few things right there, those factual differences of the faster glass and quite often not, and this to me isn't quite as quantifiable, but I will say, and I think most people would agree, that little bit of a faster acquisition of focus and just speed of keeping up with fast moving targets. Are those advantages worth it to you? That's up for you to decide, you know? It was for me just because I really do love the look and the fact that I can really push myself. And I do push this gear to its limit. Just for example, the other day I was out with this lens shooting handheld at between 1/4 of a second and 1/15 of a second, shooting in the dark at night with just some urban lights on a bridge lighting up my subjects 2 hours after sunset. You know, this is the only lens I could do it with. I could not do it with this zoom lens. It just is not fast enough. It's not letting enough light in for me to be able to do that. So this lets me do certain things. And does it give me more consistently that beautiful, clean, soft background? Yeah, it certainly does. It's not to say I can't get it with that zoom lens though. So advantages, speed of focus, it's fast, low light capability, that sort of thing. Disadvantages, the obvious one, price. They're just, especially these big ones, astronomically expensive. The smaller, lighter weight ones are much less expensive, which means they're more accessible, and that's a good thing. But you start to then lose that advantage of the really fast apertures for that really good blur and letting more light in, right? So there's a trade-off there as well. The other major disadvantage is very obvious, the size and weight of this thing, okay? They're so much lighter, it's great. I almost exclusively hand hold this lens now, but that doesn't mean it is the best for when I'm gonna do a long hike, or if I really need to get myself in some awkward positions and that sort of thing and be maneuverable and flexible. Sometimes it's just too heavy. So those are the downsides of it for me. I am glad I have it, but I will say, when I got my first prime lens, I thought, this is it, I'm a prime shooter now, I'm never shooting anything else, prime lenses are it, they're the best. In 2023, I shot this 100 to 400 more than I shot that 400 2.8. It's changed for me. It really has. And so this was the first true wildlife zoom lens I've gotten since I got into wildlife photography. I started with a 70 to 200 2.8 with a 1.4 teleconverter connected. And then I went to a 300 f4 prime, and then I had shot prime since. So it was 300 f4 prime, and then the 500 f4 prime. And then when I switched to this, the 400 2.8 prime. But then shortly after that, I got this 100 to 400, just to kind of see what it's about, and because my style and my goals had changed. My style and goals had changed into, I want to show more habitat. Turns out this 100 to 400 is absolutely ideal for me for that. But let's talk some regular advantages. Price, way, way cheaper. Just flat out, all these sort of zooms, these more compact zooms are generally going to be cheaper than especially the big primes, but even some of those mid-range, lighter weight primes. So that's a great advantage. And weight, like this thing, I can walk around all day with this, no problem. It's so much lighter than dragging that around. Also, there are times where I'm just shooting awkward positions. There's some marshes that I shoot where, not because I don't want to get wet or dirty, but because of the marsh grass, the height I need is somewhere right around in here, right? It's a lot easier to do that with this, and especially hold it out with your hand here, you know, balance it and get exactly that right height than it is with that heavy lens. That I can do it with that for 30 seconds or so, and then my arm starts getting sore and trembly and shaky, and it's hard to compose and keep focus on the subject. Whereas this, I can do it all day and all night. The other thing is, sometimes I use my flip screen to just get a really low perspective. So I flip that screen out, and I'm not gonna do it here, but I hold it really down low, and then I can say, look, I can just hold this and shoot with one hand. I can compose and focus with it, with my thumb actually, or with my regular finger, right? I can do all of that with this zoom lens. And then the most obvious advantage is zooms. So it changes perspective. I used to be like those prime lens elitists. I was one of them, I admit it. I'll raise my hand and say I had that for a period of time. I used to think, you just zoom with your feet, right? You just get closer or you move back if you need to. And there is something to be said for that. I really do like this sort of compositional thought that comes into play with a prime lens. It sort of sometimes forces you to kind of think a little bit differently. But once you really know what you're doing, you kind of have an idea about how you want to compose things, how you want to frame stuff, what you want to include, and how you want to change that relationship between foreground, subject, and background as far as scale and depth of field and all of that. The zoom lens just gives you so much more flexibility, so much more flexibility. And to me, one of the best things, this 100 to 400, 400 millimeter, boom. I'm shooting basically the same as this giant prime, right? 400 millimeter. So that tight telephoto portrait shot with a nice blurred background. It's at 5.6, it's not 2.8, so is it gonna be not quite as blurred? Yes, but it's gonna look fine as long as I have that background separation I need. Then I can just do that and I'm at 100 millimeter. All of a sudden I'm showing all the habitat, the bird is small in frame or whatever subject I'm photographing, and I can just include so much more. That is huge without me having to move. If I wanted to do that with the prime, I'd have to run away. Probably not run, but I'd have to go really far away to make that same thing. And then the relationship of everything changes. I'm farther away, the subject is now essentially closer to the background than I am to the subject when I move away. So a lot of things change there. And none of that happens when I just stand here and go from 400 to 100. So yes, there's an obvious advantage there, much more flexibility in your framing and composition with a zoom lens. And it's a great thing. And the downside is not quite as fast for flight stuff. I can shoot most things in flight with this, but there are some species, some seabirds like puffins flying in fast, warblers in flight, like songbirds, tiny things, shorebirds in flight. This just doesn't quite keep up. It's not to say I can't get shots with this lens, I certainly can, but just nowhere near as consistently as I can with that big fast prime lens. And it makes sense, right? There's a reason that costs what it does, and it better be better for it. If it was just the same as far as focus speed and quality and all that, it'd be kind of weird to spend that much money on it, right? Why would it exist? So there are advantages to that for that type of things. But for the most part, almost everything else in flight, I can shoot just fine with this. It really does a great job. It's still these modern zoom lenses on every system, Canon, Sony, Nikon, they're all amazing. They really work well. Quality difference? Yes, technically if I pixel peep, I can see a sharpness difference between that 400 2.8 and this. In the real world, when I actually shrink it down and share it online, either on my website or Instagram, I cannot tell the difference. So in my mind, the flexibility of the zoom now far often outweighs the lack of flexibility of that prime and just the comfort of being able to take this out, be out for longer periods of time, go for those hikes and just use it. And so because of that, and because of how I've changed how I like to shoot, which means me getting closer to subjects and showing them more, with more habitat, I now shoot this more than I shoot that, you know? And so that's the reality of it. So with all this, I can't answer that question for you, but those are the things, the advantages and the disadvantages I find of each prime versus zoom. And hopefully it gives you something to think about if you're trying to make that decision. I do feel for you if you're struggling between the two. There is no right answer, but like I said in the beginning, whatever you choose, you're gonna make the best of it. You're probably gonna get out and do some great work with it. And then maybe eventually down the road, you can end up getting both. And that way you can have either or for the best situation. All right, happy shooting out there. I'll see you on the next one.